Speaker. This bill is a shambles, and so is the Lord Chancellor's approach to crime. Far than being a significant reforming measure, it's an incoherent fragment. From these benches, we admire the panache with which the Lord Chancellor, as a much-loved and robust performer, has sought to rise above the U-turns forced on him by a Prime Minister who's more interested in the headlines than in reform, but it doesn't wash. The Justice Secretary should take particular note of the criticism from his own benches, the significant criticism from the Chair of the Justice Select Committee, and the Right Honourable Member for Berwick-upon-Tweed kindly said that he thought the baby wasn't totally being thrown out with the bathwater. Well, I'm not sure about that, and I'm certainly worried about the health of the baby. When the Secretary of State was in office as Home Secretary, he did indeed preside over a crime wave. He also offended virtually every profession in sight, particularly the police, with the cavalier way in which he fulfilled his duties. This bill is a shambles, his strategy is in tatters, and everyone is in confusion. And the main problem is that he has such a piecemeal approach to the whole issue. And I would quote from the report of the Justice Select Committee, Cutting Crime, the Case for Justice Reinvestment, and it says this: a piecemeal approach to justice reinvestment is unlikely to work, and a holistic approach to reform is necessary, with a very clear and explicit statement of the purpose of the whole system against which organisational aims can be tested to assess their contribution to cutting the extent and seriousness of offending and re-offending. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill fails that test. In that report, we also called for better use of resources and a focus of every part of the criminal justice system on cutting offending. Why? Because that's what victims want. We keep being told that the views of victims are important, but what we're told is that victims want more than not to have become a victim in the first place, is to know that they won't become a victim again in the future. And therefore the purpose of the criminal justice system, the purpose of sentencing, has to ensure that the victims are protected from further offending. So let's cut to the chase. Cutting the number of people in prison may save money, but cutting prison numbers to save money is to approach the problem for the wrong end. There is only one acceptable reason for cutting prison numbers: that offending and re-offending is down, that fewer people are becoming victims, that there are fewer offenders who need to be incarcerated, that our streets and our homes are safer. It's a matter of some pride to me that the number of places in young offender institutions has been cut for precisely that reason. As a result of the work of the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales and the youth offending teams, fewer individuals are re-offending, and so fewer places are needed. That reduction in numbers leads to immediate savings, but it's even more significant than that, given that time in custody often acts as a training course in criminal activity for our young people. So the long-term benefit of keeping people out of youth offending and preventing their re-offending patterns is absolutely enormous. And that makes it extremely strange, very odd indeed, for the Secretary of State to be doing away with the Youth Justice Board. And I urge him to reconsider. I know he's taking much of the activities inside the Department for Justice, and I'm glad that he's continuing those activities, glad that he's encouraging the continuation of the youth offending teams, but he's taking in people who, as an independent body, have acted as the touchstone for encouraging the success in that whole aspect of reducing re-offending. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
The gentleman has obviously great experience and was the architect of the first legislation coming in 1997, and so will be interested in the fact that re-offending rates are so high over those 13 years and the accountability of the previous government for that. But would you not welcome within this bill the fact that there is now a provision for supervision of prisoners who have a sentence of under 12 months? Previously, there's no supervision of any sort for that, but within this bill, there's provision now to give supervision after they're released if they have a sentence of under 12 months, which no doubt will help stop them re-offending.
A long time that we should be doing more to ensure that short sentences work and that they're not an accelerator in offending. In this legislation, there are things to be welcomed, but the big picture is not bright enough for us to welcome the bill as a whole. Yesterday, the Justice Secretary said that in answer to a question that I asked him, that the Sentencing Council is already under a duty to provide information about the effectiveness of sentence practices. But the point is that unless there's a clear focus on reducing reoffending and making sure that that is understood by sentencers, it won't be effective. And that's why I call on him again to change his approach and put a real focus on the work of the Sentencing Council, not just to provide information about the effectiveness of sentencing practice, but to make sure that that sentencing practice is driven in ways that can increase the success of the system. My point is that the work of the Youth Justice Board and the Youth Offending Team shows what can be done if there's a clear and unremitting focus on cutting offending and reoffending. Why not? I suggest this to ministers. Give that focus again through a new mechanism from the 18 to 25 age group. We are seeing people coming in the 18 to 25 group in reduced numbers because of the success of intervention with young offenders. Why not learn that lesson and in that reduced cohort of 18 to 25 further drive down the numbers who reoffend after they reoffend in the first place by learning those lessons and applying them properly? The Justice Secretary has admitted that the criminal justice system doesn't work as a single system. It's fragmented. There are a series of agencies that operate to their own objectives and are held to account for different purposes. We'll bring it all together, make it coherent. Let's have some coherent legislation from the Justice Secretary. It doesn't work as a single system, and he should pay attention to all the recommendations, not just one or two, of the Select Committee for Justice on justice reinvestment, and make the whole of the criminal justice system focus on reducing reoffending. What victims want, as I've said, is to see themselves less likely to be offended against in the future. And again, the Home Affairs Select Committee heard evidence from people who had been involved in restorative justice. It actually works. It works in facing offenders with their offending and make it less likely that they will reoffend, because it engages them in relationships, which is very often the failure that has led them into offending in the first place. They don't see the victim as another person. It is essential that we do something about what has been described as relational justice, but we don't see anything about this in this legislation. It's too often too low down the agenda. The possibility is there, but we are not driving it through the system and not getting the benefits. And I would appeal to the Secretary of State to push that up his agenda. I would also appeal with him to work with the Home Secretary to drive greater success from crime reduction partnerships, which again have been important, as my right honourable friend said in his contribution a few moments ago. We've been successful in reducing crime, but we can go further and we can go faster if the right mechanisms are used. Now, I commend in this regard the violence reduction project in Cardiff, which since I last referred to it in this chamber has been endorsed by the World Health Organization and is the subject of an article in the British Medical Journal, which shows that the approach in Cardiff has driven down violent crime by 25% more than a cohort of cities with which it can properly be compared. It works. It reduces offences. It protects people from becoming victims. And that is what needs to be put at the centre of our criminal justice system. I regret that at the present time we have a Home Secretary who has failed to defend her budget and is imposing cuts on the police which are too deep, too sudden and disgracefully front-loaded, and the Secretary of State for Justice who, by his failure to apply clarity and logic to the challenge of justice reinvestment and effectiveness in cutting crime, is doomed to fail. Sadly, he won't pay the penalty for that. Victims will.